tea break. So I'm going to whiz through sort of a couple of the ones at the start. It's also nice to see some friendly faces, people I've met before at Solar Sphere and a few other places as well. But anyway, enough of that, let's get on. What I'm going to talk about tonight, a little bit about who I am, what I do, why do I observe the sun, and why is the sun the thing that is my specialist subject, if you like. We'll briefly cover some safety, but I'm going to jump onto that. Going to talk about how we can observe it, the effects of it as well, and somewhere in there, I've kind of got a pause slide, which I hope will time for about sort of 8:05, 8:10, something like that. And then looking at outreach, which I know the society as a whole it's very big within the society, and the whole concept of outreach. And I think it's one of the reasons why sort of stood here looking back into the room that you've got so many people in here as well. And then also sort of from that, what next, the sort of things that you can do if you have planned outreach and it's cloudy. Okay, which I've bought some solar glasses with me for the society, so it's probably going to be cloudy for a while. Okay. So a few things about I suppose about me. You might have spotted me in Sky at Night. The guys there will sort of contact me a couple of times a year generally, with something or the other on the sun. There was some features on the eclipse a few years ago. Also some book reviews, things like that. The chap in the centre with me there, with the big egghead, is a guy called Stephen Ramsden, which if you are on social media, on Facebook, on Google+, on Twitter, on any really other platforms. Stephen represents a charity in the States called the Charlie Bates Solar Astronomy Project. And Charlie Bates Solar Astronomy Project, I suppose, if you like, is the organisation that I work with, and they're the guys who provide the glasses. And what our aim in terms of outreach is to be sharing the sun. And there we are there, that's the field, the solar observing field at Solar Sphere. And it's all about this whole thing about the outreach. In my day job, I work in a school in Dudley in the West Midlands. There's me at work there, which is where I've pretty much come straight from this afternoon. It's been a whistle-stop 4 hours from the bowels of Wolverhampton to up to Liverpool. When I'm not doing solar astronomy, I like playing around on canal boats. We've got a boat moored up in Tetnall near Wolverhampton, and often it's a bit of one of those dilemmas because the sun's off and out when you want to go out on the boat, and the sun doesn't come out very often. I like playing around in Iceland, just come back from there over Christmas, and again talking about the outreach thing there, the Hertzman So Festival, and very importantly, and one of the things that drew me to this society was the promise that after tonight's meeting there's a pub straight across the road, and there's various people going for a pint, so you'd sure hooked me in on that one. Okay, so why the sun for me? I'm conscious when I show this slide, I'm showing it to predominantly, normally, nighttime observers, and they kind of sit there and you can almost feel the grur coming from them, in the sense they're thinking, well, yeah, it's cloudy, it's light polluted for us as well. And there I am, based in the lovely red blob of Birmingham in the centre. As you guys up there, there's not much difference. And I'm kind of aware that lots of people do take lovely images of the night sky from really quite light polluted places. But for me, I think the reason why it's difficult, shall we say, is that dreaded alarm clock at sort of 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. And that all kind of comes back to my day job. I need to be up, I need to be at work. Gone are the days where I can kind of stay up till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, then get back up at 5:30 in the morning, off I toddle to work, and try and remain not grumpy all day. It doesn't work. So I'm afraid, I would say I need my beauty sleep, but beauty is probably not the word, but I certainly need sleep. So for me, I've kind of shelved nighttime astronomy. I'm not interested in it. I thoroughly enjoy it. We're away over Christmas in Iceland, and I just took the binoculars with me, a pair of 10x40s, 10x42s actually, and it really was great just to go out and sort of refresh myself with the night sky, sort of looking at the winter constellations, because I don't think you ever forget these things, but they kind of go to the back of the mind. And especially this year, this time of year as well. I was talking out there in the foyer. For me, the sun is, I live in an urban environment, and the sun is low, and it's in the trees, it's in the rooftops, So I'm kind of looking forward to spring coming on. Other reasons for the sun. I love the social side of outreach and the whole. I suppose the people that come with it. I'm not saying that you don't get lots of people at the night time, but certainly being out in the sunshine, it's warm normally, maybe. Hopefully we can get away with t-shirts and things like that. But it's kind of nice, I think, to get out and we sort of got pictures out. That's the International Astronomy Show from sort of a few years ago. We've got the Elan Valley there on International Sunday from a few years ago. That's the International Astronomy Show again. It's just kind of fun, I think, to get out there and be talking to people. And I love a good natter. I really do enjoy talking to people. And then, of course, the sun gives us all these lovely sunrises and sunsets and things. And this is from October, maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago. I'm not sure, but there was kind of this lovely conjunction. There was Venus, Jupiter, and Mars, and then down there, you can't see it on the image there, but there was Mercury tucked away as well. And I love these sorts of things, so you get the halo displays. It's from a mountain in Switzerland. And all these things, ultimately, it's the sun has a hand in, if you like, in producing them. It's a light from the sun that produces them. And give me these sort of things any day. Over sort of TV. We just got my TV died over Christmas, as well as the central heating boiler. It was picked up a new TV in the sales, and now all of a sudden I seem to be able to get hundreds of TV channels, and I keep flicking through them. They don't bother me at all. I'm really not interested. Still having this new TV, I can sort of kind of sit there with the TV off, and I'd much rather sort of take in these natural views, sort of looking up rather than looking at TV. Okay, so the old obligatory safety first with the sun. The simple rule that I say to people is, if you don't know what you're doing, don't do it. You've got a huge group of people here. I know you've got knowledgeable solar observers here. If you're not sure what to do, don't do it. You can pick up sort of solar filters, these beta solar filters. Sort of £20, and at that sort of price, it really isn't worth risking your eyesight. The old thing about looking through CDs, holding CDs up, or welder's glasses. And people always think welder's glasses are safe, but welder's glasses come in different grades. And if you're not sure about your welder's glasses, unless you're a welder and you know your glasses, I wouldn't recommend them really. It's about prolonged exposure. To your retinas. It's not worth risking. There are loads of safe ways of doing it. Okay, whizzing on. One of the questions I often get is this one here, which is what colour is the sun? We kind of we imagine it sort of set in sunrise and sunsets and these nice sort of golden sunrises, golden sunsets. But the truth of the matter is the sun is emitting light. Or electromagnetic waves over a whole range of wavelengths. Okay, and certainly what we're seeing, the image on the screen there, that's the solar spectrum. That is sort of splitting up sunlight into its individual components, and then all these dark little bands down here, all these correspond to the different elements that make up the sun, and some of them are more interesting than others. So down here, that kind of dark patch there, that's the hydrogen alpha, which is the view of the sun of the flames that people kind of associate with. We also get down up here, we've got the calcium lines, which is kind of the purple sun, which people associate with as well. So it's a whole range of colours, and it's these colours, depending on which one we look at, that can tell us different things about the sun. Okay, so if you If you imagine a light source just shooting out light like that, okay, you get this continuous spectrum. But if we've got a hot source there, so think of the centre of the sun, a big nuclear reactor, passing through relatively cool gas, think the atmosphere of the sun, we get these absorption lines, these dark lines. And these dark lines correspond with the elements that make up this gas cloud. And those of you who sort of look at nebulas and things like that, will, you use all these different nebula filters that look at these quite specific wavelengths, these quite specific colours of the sun. Okay, and then again for nebulas, another one you can get is a warm cloud of gas, which will emit light at a certain colour, and then you'll sort of get these one colours of this one colour of light. And with the sun, there's lots of ways you can look at it, but certainly probably the most interesting is hydrogen alpha. It's certainly the easiest to see. There's calcium, which is the purple one, and there's also more recently sodium. We can look in sodium light as well. And all these things, they show us different things, different views of the sun. Okay, so some of the best views, I think, come from our friends at NASA with the Solar Dynamics Observatory. It's been up there now for, it's in its 8th year. Well, very, very nearly 8 years actually, 36,000 kilometres above us, and a whopping $817 million US, which probably, I'm saying it's whopping, maybe in the scheme of things that isn't a lot when you start looking at sort of the economies of countries. But what they've got there is they are looking I think it's every 15, 13 seconds, at a whole range of different wavelengths. And these different wavelengths, they show the different features of the sun. And I always kind of liken the sun to be a bit like an onion, okay, with these different layers. And the Solar Dynamics Observatory, for me, you can find these things all over the web. Some of the movies, some of the animations it produces are absolutely stunning. And you've sort of got we've got post-flare loops there. You've got it's called coronal rain, and pretty much exactly the same process as we get rain on Earth or other planets. As well, so it's cooling, it's precipitating down. We've got the transit of Venus going across there. Again, we've got a flare, more post-flare loops, coronal mass ejections, these huge eruptions throwing off plasma into space, and then there we go. We've got an eclipse down in the bottom left, and also here we've got these active regions. Okay, different views. This is our hydrogen alpha view of the sun, and we can see here we've got all these different features, these dark clouds, these lighter areas. We've got people describing as the flames around the edges. Okay, and a lot of these images, pretty much most of the images throughout, are ones I've taken myself. This one here, it's only taken with a 40mm telescope, a Coronado 40mm scope, and in the world of solar telescopes, that's pretty much as small as you can get. But despite it being a quite small scope and full discs, we get lots of nice detail. Okay, we get calcium, which is looking at a slightly different layer in the sun, and I almost liken calcium, these bright white areas. It's like magnetic froth, or if you the plasma's frothing up. Okay, it's a bit like the froth on your pint of beer, to come back to a beer analogy, or sort of the soap suds when you're washing up, things like that. And it kind of shows a whole load of different features, which we'll sort of see later on, that are different between the two wavelengths. You get your traditional view, which is white light, and that's when that was sort of several years ago. The sun's a lot quieter now. There are still sunspots around. They tend to be smaller, more singular sunspots, and we are heading towards solar minimum, so activity is decreasing. What that does mean for the long-term investors in you, now is a great time to be buying solar telescopes, because I see more and more of them coming on the market. People are putting them up for sale because there's less to see. If you have got the cash invested in them, there's some good deals going around to be had. But white light is by far the easiest way, I think, to get into solar. I'll talk a little bit later on about the details of that. And if we compare the view, again, all three images taken through 40mm telescope, 400mm focal length, showing the different features, and we can we can identify similar ones across the disk. So we've got the sunspots. See where the sunspots are there. We've got these brighter areas, the plage regions. They're also, you can kind of see them certainly on the closer versions of the white light images as well. What we did for time, we're okay. Okay, so I mentioned the sun is. I use the analogy of an onion with these different layers. So we've got right at the centre. We've got the hot core down there at sort of about 14 million degrees. And then we've got these different zones, these convective zones. You know, if you imagine the energy's got to get out, and it's setting up these huge convection cells like you get in fluids. But then, as we get nearer the surface, in the photosphere, we get the sunspots, and the white light view is what we see in the photosphere. It's also in the calcium view as well, the purple views. Slightly different layer, slightly higher up. But then we've got the chromosphere, which is kind of, I suppose, the more interesting layer for us because it's the easiest one to see, which we can see with the hydrogen alpha. And that's sort of several thousand kilometres above the photosphere. I almost think of it this thin atmosphere. I'll use that phrase very loosely, but a thin atmosphere. And then around the edges of the sun, we've got the corona, which, unless you've got a corona scope, which very fiddly and can be expensive. The best time to see the corona is during the eclipse, total solar eclipse, which hopefully some of you got to see earlier this year in the States. Okay, so a few of the things. How are we for time? I need to clock. We're okay. We're okay. So active regions. What I've got going on here, these are time lapses. Okay, so you'll notice that the sort of subtle changes going on. And for me, this is one of the key reasons I like observing the sun. These animations span about 10 minutes. Okay, so and I'm probably taking a frame, well, a series of frames actually, maybe every sort of 20 seconds, something like that. So we're looking maybe in total sort of 20 or 30 frames, something like that, thereabouts, to make up these animations. And for me, the sun is so dynamic. You can kind of see all these little bits of flaring going on here. And this isn't a huge scope. I'm not taking this with a huge scope at all. This is a bog standard 4-inch TAL, the Russian TAL refractor, okay, with a Daystar quark on the back of that, okay. And the sun really is dynamic, and if it is out for long enough, one of the things I do like to do is take these animations and active regions. What your active regions are, if you imagine, the sun's all about magnetic fields, and we get these magnetic field lines which are coming out of the surface of the sun, arcing out. If you imagine the experiments in school with the bar magnets and the iron filings, we've got the same things going on, and you can, particularly in this image here, you can kind of see these arcing lines, and the sunspots are opposite polarity, and we get these flows of plasma. Plasma's electrically charged, so in a magnetic field it will flow. Okay, and I do like taking these animations because you really never know what you're going to get. There's kind of so many things going on. We get solar flares, and these are the things that people associate with the sun the most. You know, you see it on the Space website all the time. It says, has there been a solar flare? Is there going to be auroras? And the solar flares in these images here are these bright patches again on the limb there. I mentioned before the post-flare loops. That's another little animation going there again with the 40mm scope. So you really don't need huge scopes to see a lot of detail going on the sun. And there we've got the plasma after the flare. It's been thrown off out from the surface of the sun. It's not quite got escape velocity, so the sun's gravity is pulling it down as it pulls it down. The plasma's condensing, or recondensing I suppose, and it's raining back down towards the surface. And there we have in the centre there the arcing of the flare crackling away. And we can see flares in a number of wavelengths, so on the limb there you can kind of see it popping, crackling away in calcium wavelengths as well. And you'll sort of see around the sunspot here in that area, it's crackling away. And these most of these animations really are over about 10 minutes because I'll be quite honest, it's not really sunny for longer than about 10 minutes and let anyone go. That's about as long as you can kind of, I think, image. Maybe there's some days that are longer, but generally about 10 minutes is the maximum. We get prominences. These are what people call, when they look through the hydrogen alphascope, they'll say we can see the flames on the side of the sun. And what it is, on the sun, if it's darker, it's generally a cooler temperature. And these prominences, quite simply, are just clouds of plasma. These cooler clouds of plasma that are being held aloft above the surface of the sun by magnetic fields. And when they are on the edge of the sun, we see them in side profile, and all these flame-like structures. And again, they are dynamic. This image here, and you can kind of get an idea of scale if you imagine the whole size of the sun there. That's subtending probably, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 degrees of an arc on the sun, something like that. So you're talking really quite huge features. And that animation there, it's only sort of half a dozen frames, but that was really quite dynamic, and that was happening over probably about 12 minutes. It was pretty quick. You can almost, when you're looking through the scope, if you're looking visually, you can't quite see the movement. It's neat. You think you can see it, but it's not quite there. But if you went away, you have your brew. You come back a few minutes later, and it notably has changed. And like the image at the top there, and that one actually, these are all calcium images. We also get prominences in calcium wavelengths. They are there. And you just need clear skies. If we have these milky skies that we often get here in the UK, you aren't going to see prominences in calcium wavelengths. But if we do get those rare blue days, I call them the days when you're on holiday. You go away on holiday and you're looking up in the sky and the sky is just blue. And you stop there thinking, I wish it was this blue at home, and it never is it? But we maybe get 3 or 4 of those each year, and on those days it's great to see the prominences in calcium wavelengths. Okay. We also then get filaments, and a filament is exactly pretty much the same as a prominence. It's this dark structure here, and these again are these dark clouds, these darker clouds of plasma, but they're just on the face of the sun. And what you sometimes get a bit like here, or here, where it's on both the face and also the limb at the same time. It's a term, was amateurs ended up coining, and the professionals have stolen actually. And it's been called a filaprom, cross between a filament and a prominence. And I remember coming back to mention Solar Sphere before. One of the boys, one of the young lads at Solar Sphere a few years ago, he came up and he was looking through the scopes, and he got all excited and he couldn't control himself. And he said, "I can see space worms! I can see space worms!" And he was over the moon about seeing these space worms. And what he was seeing was the prominences, the filaments, these darker filaments on the disk of the sun. And I remember the little lad. He kept coming back throughout the day. "Are the space worms still there? Yeah, come on, you have a look." And he totally loved these space worms. It made his weekend. But they are there to be seen. Sunspots, again, visible over a range of wavelengths. Pretty big things, something like that, probably the size of Earth, something like that. We're getting up towards the size of maybe Uranus, Neptune. They're pretty big. They're where the magnetic fields are punching out, if you like, from beneath the sun. So often they'll occur in pairs. I mentioned that before. So you'll have a north and a south pole sunspot. Sometimes they're more dominant. One of the poles may be more dominant, and they're cooler. That's why they're darker. I mentioned that before. If you like, the photosphere of the sun, the normal surface of the sun, if you can call it a surface, about 6,500 degrees. The sunspots themselves are about 4,500. So still pretty hot, but it's a contrast effect. Okay, it's all about contrast. So it looks darker, it appears darker. Okay, around sunspots, all this I described it as magnetic froth before. This is called plage, okay, and we get it in a range of wavelengths. You can see it in the hydrogen alpha there. We can see it faintly in the white light. It's not as prominent. It's easier to see towards the limb of the sun. But certainly in calcium light, it's there. And plage, certainly with calcium, one of the things that is quite possible to do, before a sunspot appears, you'll often get a region of plage forming. So you can kind of, you think, oh, I wonder if we're getting a sunspot forming. So it starts off as a small region, start getting larger and larger and larger, and then all of a sudden, maybe a day or two later, we get the dark sunspot kind of popping through the middle of it. Okay, and really quite easy to see. If you can see in calcium, and I'm afraid if we're older, the chances are you can't. As we get older, the corneas in our eyes yellow, and we naturally see less and less of the ultraviolet spectrum, the blue light. But children, young people, can see the calcium wavelengths down at sort of 393 nanometers, and it's kind of like this, like a crackling on a duck egg, is the way of describing it. I can kind of just see a blur, but that's kind of, I suspect partly because I know what I'm looking for. But a lot of people look through it and say, no, I can't see anything. But kids absolutely love calcium, looking at the calcium light. Transits, love them or hate them. It's just about being in the right place at the right time. I'm about 15 miles west of the airport, so in the summer I can observe first thing in the morning, and the sun is kind of low in the east, and as the jets are coming into land. You're going to have my phone, by the way. My phone's ringing at the moment, so I do apologise. I told you it had been me who was putting all these noises on your recording, so it's buzzing away in my pocket. I should have turned it off. It is on silent. Anyway, and there we go. A lot of it's purely by chance. Again, this was a shot taken in winter. You can really get an impression of the poor scene there, the boiling of the atmosphere. Okay, it's all about timing. We had the transit to Mercury a few years ago, and it was. I was planning on doing outreach at school. It was cloudy all day. It was only when I got home. I wouldn't say as it cleared, but it got less cloudy. The cloud got thinner. That was with. I've got an 8-inch Schmidt Cassegrain scope with a filter specifically for looking at the sun, and it was only really with cranking up the exposure on the camera and backing off the density on the filter. You can kind of punch through the cloud a bit, and we were able to see Mercury passing across the sun. And it was, that was something that, looking high power through the eyepiece, you really did get this perception of movement of the planet across the disk. It was quite eerie. There's the eclipses. A few of the shots that I showed at the start, the partial eclipse a few years ago, we were fortunate enough for beautiful clear skies, and viewed it at school. I think we got about 800, 900 kids throughout, looking through the scope throughout the eclipse. So how I managed to image it in calcium and still get the whole thing recorded amazes me to this day, because I often find people's first response, if they're not used to a scope and you invite them to look on it, is to grab onto it and like wrestle it. They kind of wrestle the scope to their eye, you know. So how it remained in the field of view all the time, I don't know. What I'm going to do, I think it's 8:10, and I reckon you guys are ready for a brew. I reckon that's a good place for me to halt, if you're happy with that. We'll halt there, we'll grab a brew, and then jump back in whenever you give me the nod. Okay? Okay, so we kind of got to these transits and these different things that are going across the face of the sun. And some other ways we can look at the sun. I need to come back towards the screen. I'm reminded I need to be screen central. Some of the ways we can look at the sun, when it's cloudy certainly. There's a growing community around the world now who are building magnetometers, and there's kind of lots of designs on the web, but they're all based around back detectors. I don't profess to understand or know a lot about the electronics at all. That's kind of not my specialist subject. But what I do know is the people who are running them, when they're set up properly, they're recording these impacts of the solar wind, these eruptions from the sun, and that they're producing data which is pretty much comparable with professional sites, and it's a pretty good way of observing the sun. Where do these impacts come from? Well, there's a couple of places really. If you're on social media, one of the ones you'll often see pops up. It says NASA boffins discover huge black hole on the sun, and it's normally from these Huffington Post type websites and things like this. Our friend on the other side of the pond would call it fake news, but these areas here, these dark patches on the sun, they're there all the time. It's just really, there's not much news going on at all if they decide that they need to tell us that NASA's discovered these black holes. The sun isn't being eaten, it's not been eaten by aliens, there's no other conspiracy theory going on. Really what's happening is, I talked before about magnetic fields, the magnetic field lines are open, there's not much magnetic field there basically. So these darker areas, what's happening is, the sun is sending out these streams of particles, the solar wind, and one of the effects of this is to produce the northern lights, or the aurora, which I don't know what your visibility is like here, because you're kind of pretty close to a northern coast, the North Wales coast. So I'm guessing there's probably a few people in the room who have been photographing and got sort of good views of the aurora. Okay, but they do produce these great displays. I mentioned before, I love going to Iceland. I've seen the aurora, I'm going to say 2.5 times in the UK. Once, at the time as a young boy, I was living up in the Staffordshire Moorlands near Leek, that part of the world, which I suspect is what got me into astronomy with the dark skies and everything, and saw a lovely green arc at the time, and I was a member of I was probably only in my early teens maybe, but as a member of the North Staff Society, remember telling my mother that I needed to phone the chairman because there was an aurora, and my mother was having none of it and telling me, stop being ridiculous, Arthur's not going to be up at 11:30 at night, nobody's going to be up. I'm thinking, he is going to be up, he's an astronomer. And anyway, when we went to the society meeting and told them, everybody was saying, oh, you should have phoned up. But, you know, you can't win, can you? But I saw one then, I think maybe in '99, I was living up in Yorkshire, then up in Wakefield, and there was a big red aurora at the time there. And then recently, a few years ago in Anglesey, there was, go there reasonably regularly, it was flickering, shall we say, on the dials online, so I thought I'll try it. And well, it was a very faint aurora. If I stretched the image, stretched the brightness on the image, it was very there, but as I say, a 2.5 aurora, that one. But certainly in Iceland, it's one of the reasons I love Iceland with the aurora. We've been to Iceland now quite a few times, and I have to be honest, after a while, you kind of get, we found ourselves being complacent about seeing the aurora, and we're like, oh yeah, there it is again. But then we went for 2 or 3 years and there was just no aurora, and we were really unlucky. So when we went back again and the aurora was there, we were really kind of quite grateful. And you know, they produce these great displays, and it really is quite bright. You can kind of see on the ice there, or on the windscreen on the Land Rover. You know, it's reflecting away. You get these bright explosions of light, and it really can be quite. It can be bright enough to read. You know, they do get quite bright. Again, it can just be an arc, kind of a faint green arc. And what we've got there, I mentioned, we've got the solar wind. It's flowing from the sun. It's all down to magnetism, not just with the sun, but also with our planet and our magnetic field lines. And kind of in simple terms, are drawing the solar wind down to the polar regions. When the solar wind comes into the upper atmosphere, it's interacting with the atoms up there. So the colour of it, different colours, the different atoms. The greens are oxygen. I think the purples are nitrogen. You can kind of see the purpley sort of rays there. It corresponds to the different, if you like, different atoms. We also then get
these things, coronal mass ejections, and again, comes back to these magnetic field lines. If you imagine stretching an elastic band, we can keep stretching, but then there comes a point when it snaps, and hey presto, then that's what we get, this huge outflowing of plasma. Okay. Now, I'm going to whiz back a slide. I'm going to whiz back to my coronal holes a second, because I want to try and get a point across here. If you imagine our coronal mass ejections, they're often associated with flares. If you remember the images before, the flares are these kind of these bright patches that happen. They're very directional. If you imagine it, these coronal mass ejections, they're actually quite directional. And if you imagine the sun as a 360-degree sphere, and it's shooting off in a particular direction, it's kind of only going in one direction. However, make sure I get the right button here. There we go. Our coronal holes, if you imagine this coronal hole here, it's going all the way from the pole down below the southern equator. So if you imagine, it's a huge swathe, as opposed to this directional beam almost. You've got this huge swathe of material, of plasma coming from the sun. And often, my experience, I don't profess to have huge experience in this, but certainly on my Icelandic travels with auroras, is you get much better chances of seeing auroras when there's coronal holes than when there's coronal mass ejections. With a coronal mass ejection, the coronal mass ejection itself needs to be squarely aimed for Earth, and you'll often see this on space weather. If you follow that, it talks about there's been a flare, there's been a coronal mass ejection, and then they say it hasn't hit Earth, you know. And whereas our coronal holes, it's kind of this wider beam, if you like, and I think there's a much greater chance of sort of seeing things. I think I was reading tonight that Iceland, on the Iceland News website, they were saying tonight is the best chance of aurora they've had since Boxing Day. You know, and this is not down to flares, not down to coronal mass ejections, but down to these coronal holes. Okay, and here we are. Some of the images sort of have taken over the years. This is kind of one of the first ones we saw, going back probably 10 years ago now in Iceland, and it really was bright. You can see the sea there. That's, if anybody's been to Reykjavik, that's looking out over into the bay. You can see kind of how it brightens up. The sea really brightens up, and then 18 months ago we went to Iceland in the summer, and you kind of associate it with this endless, you know, the 24-hour sun. Well, we went in August, and it would stay strangely light until sort of, well, I don't know, maybe 1 o'clock in the morning, something like that, and then you'd just get enough twilight to start seeing the stars, and you'd have this sort of 2, maybe 3 hour window by the end of the week where it was dark enough you can see the stars, and really couldn't believe it. I was looking for aurora and couldn't see aurora, but the auroras were actually so intense, rather than being in the northern half of the sky, they'd passed completely overhead and were in the southern half of the sky, and we were looking in the wrong direction. And it's one of the brightest displays I've ever seen, and kind of the only thing that stops you recording is batteries on your camera. But I find them fascinating, and we went there over Christmas, and despite it being, the temperature never got above minus sort of 10, whether it was day or night, but sort of from day after Boxing Day it cleared, and we started getting some auroras, and kind of even despite this continuous, it was clear skies, but this continuous sort of 40-50 mile an hour wind, and you've got to imagine there's pellets of snow which, well, the only bit you've got visible is kind of around your eyes, but they sting. It stings like heck. It's still fascinating, and I kind of love watching the auroras every time. And you know, it's one of my favourite things. And then this year, we had the eclipse in America, and for me, I went down. My first total solar eclipse was down in '99, down in Cornwall. And in true tradition, went down with a gang of lads all in the back of a van, and we camped. I can't remember exactly where we camped, but we camped somewhere. And anyway, it was cloudy. But what kind of shocked me then was how dark it goes. You know, it's like somebody's turning off a light switch. And so for several years before last summer, there was a group of us sort of planning to go out and view the eclipse. And it was quite interesting, sort of the logistics of it all planning, because I remember we were trying to reserve bookings for hotels because we knew that it was going to be expensive. We knew that prices were going to rocket as the locals realised there was an eclipse coming. And so sort of phoning up 2 or 3 years in advance and saying, can we book? They were like, oh, just phone back in 6 months before you need to arrive. And we're like, no, we want to book, we want to book. And I'm glad we did, because America was totally chock-a-block. We thought it was going to be cloudy. Certainly the day before the eclipse it was cloudy. It hadn't been cloudy for however long, months. They'd had a drought for months. But it was cloudy the day before. But on the day of the eclipse, it cleared up, and it's an absolutely fantastic sight. You know, I kind of can't describe. We've got again a time lapse here from the GoPro going on. So there was a gang of us there, and you can see that's as it passes over the shadow of the moon. This dark wedge of a shadow passing over, and I ended up imaging it. I decided to go back to basics. So we kind of went out with a group, and there was people taking out equatorial mounts and scopes and a whole range of things. And I'd spoke to various people and decided just to keep it simple. So I went out with my trusty Canon 350D, which is they must be 10 years old now. I'm surprised it's still going, but it is. And just a 70 to 300mm telephoto lens, really cheapo jobby. I think it was about 69 quid. You know, I'm not talking expensive gear here. And just some of the beta solar film, and popped that on the front, whipped off during totality, and I was kind of quite pleased with the results. I still haven't got around to processing them all yet. It's took hundreds and hundreds of pictures. One of the things that I did find a lesson for me, and a lesson for any of you maybe here. The telephoto lens, you obviously zoom it out to get to 300mm, which is where I was at. But the weight of it was causing the lens to sag back. So as I started to look at my pictures, when I got back home, I was like, the sun's getting smaller, what's going on? And the weight of the lens was causing it to zoom in on itself. But an absolutely fascinating sight. We got there at sunrise, watched the sun come up, which was nice, and then just watch the eclipse pass over, and they're magical events. They really are magical. And if you haven't, and if you can get out to see a total solar eclipse, I wholeheartedly recommend it. I think the next one, I always get the dates wrong here. Is it 2028 in the States? I think that's over about Easter time. I think there's one in 2 years before in the summer, which is kind of visible from a few of the peninsulas in Iceland, which I may have to go there and see that. But great sight, absolutely great sight. You know, this thing, you kind of understand why some people call it the eye of God when you see it in the sky there, and you get the corona, these devil horns on it, and the diamond ring effect. You know, it's absolutely fascinating to see the shadow approaching this wedge, this dark wedge. And the only way I can kind of describe it when it's totality, it's like a 360-degree sunset. You've got the dark sky overhead, you can see the stars, but then you've got this orange glow like you get at sunset. But normally at sunset, it's just in the west, or if it's sunrise in the east, but it just circles the entire horizon. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. What I was going to put on, I'm going to skip this, I may stick this on at the end if people are still about. This was going to be my tea break slide, and it's just kind of a video of the thing, kind of the whole eclipse. But what you can see on it as well, you've got the sunspots, so there's some black dots on there.
shadow or two. It's like alien hands.
That is weird.
Oh, Jenny. E.T. hands.
Look, shadows are starting to affect. So look between your fingers.
Yeah, E.T. hands.
You're starting to.
Oh, what is
Yeah.
it? That's so weird.
Aliens.
Why
does that happen? E.T. go home.
Because normally the sun's like a big disc, but it's a smaller disc now, so it's kind of the way it interacts with the shadows.
That's so cool.
You'll see shadows get longer as well. It's quite peculiar.
Oh, that's clever. All right, thanks for that. Right, you were saying?
Oh, anyway, somehow she lost track of time.
Put your hands out there. We're starting to get weird shadow effect. Look between your fingers. It looks like you've got stumpy. Yeah? So between the fingers, can you see loops between?
Oh, you're right.
I couldn't even pop my headset all the way.
Don't bring it up.
Don't mention
Yeah, it's still like after 3 years, but we
E.T. hands.
Oh my god!
Hands over there.
Yeah, we need to be on this side.
Yeah.
Iba na yung kulay ng ground. You know, when it goes...
Looking good.
You seem being a star.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh wow, weird.
What light is this?
Ready for the dimmer switch. It's almost here.
Trouble is the iPhone is overcompensating.
Here we go. Dimmer switch coming up now.
Oh yeah.
Can you see it feels like
Oh yeah, the shadow's coming.
Shadow's coming on the horizon. The moon's shadow. Over there. The dark patch.
one of the flags.
The moon's shadow. The dark patch.
Whoa!
Right on the horizon. It's getting dark. That's the moon's shadow coming towards us.
Wow, this is funny light. This is so funny light. Unbelievable.
Here we go.
Oh my goodness.
Here we go.
Wow.
Shadow bands. On the clock. Shadow bands. John, shadow bands.
Shadow back where?
Shadow bands on the clock.
Well done.
Oh, look at that.
Sunset.
Fantastic.
There's a prominence on the left hand side, can you see it? Got the prominence? Mark.
Oh my gosh, that's unbelievable.
Shame it doesn't last very long.
Holy wow. Getting light. Over there.
Okay, diamond ring. Diamond ring coming. Here we go. Diamond ring.
Diamond ring. Elders on. Glasses on.
Glasses on.
Whoa.
Wait.
This
It's like a jewel.
this just overexposes everything.
Oh, that just didn't stay in my head for long enough.
Yeah.
I know.
Right, it's still there, still doing its thing.
Nakita mo yun, girl?
Oh, wow. That ring.
Not the corona, no.
Okay, so if you want to observe the sun, how can you do it? What are the ways? You know, what is the best way to do it? I think at the moment, probably to get hydrogen alpha views. So these prominences, the filaments, the plage, things like that. You need a hydrogen alpha scope. And probably the cheapest way at the moment is the Coronado PST. That's kind of the scope that started the whole solar revolution. Way back when, you could pick them up for 500 quid. They're floating probably about £800 to £900 now. They're getting more and more expensive. You can jump up to the 60mm scope, which you can pick up for, I don't know, maybe £1,300, £1,400. Starts going big bucks in the world of solar. They've got a 90mm scope there, lovely scope if you get the chance to look through them. But then you're sailing up at sort of several £1,000s. They're expensive things. They have their own range of eyepieces, which if you're into, I really wouldn't recommend them. They're just they're bog standard Plossels. They just have the same livery as the scopes. You know, some people like having matching things, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But you're paying over £100 for a Plossel eyepiece, and you can pick up the same style of eyepiece off something like Astro Boot or something like that for about 20 quid. You know, there's no need to spend the silly money to get the results. Over recent years, another American firm called Lunt has entered the market, and they're firmly established now. They do a range of scopes from the 50mm. Got one of those myself. I was speaking to a few people earlier about that. They do a 60mm scope, an 80mm scope, a 100mm scope, a 150mm scope, and sort of prices. For me, the Lunt 50, and I think the Society's got one. I'm fairly certain you guys have got one here. Maybe I think it's an ideal sweet spot type of scope, because you're looking at about £1,000. You've got the pressure tuning, which I think it's better than the tilt tuning, which the Coronados use. But to get sort of 10mm more aperture, so going to the 60mm scope, you're doubling in price, and you're certainly not doubling in aperture. And for me, that sort of size scope, you're only doing full discs, these whole disc views of the sun. You can get close-ups, but you can't really get that close-up. The 80mm scope, we're cruising in there about £4,000 or £5,000, depending on focuser options and accessories and things like that. The 100mm scope, again, probably £5,000 or £6,000. It's all silly money in solar. And then the 150mm scope there, we're sailing up well above 8,000 quid, which is silly, to be honest with you. And one of my favourite hobbies, I'll call it, in the world of solar is modifying these scopes. So, for example, taking the back off a smaller scope, putting it on the front of a larger refractor, and getting something pretty much equal in performance for a fraction of the cost. Again, don't do it if it's not something you're familiar with. But there are certainly loads of places out there. Charlie Bates' Solar Astronomy Project, we've got a forum, which we'll talk about at the end, and certainly there's a whole section on there which you can safely find out how to work with these scopes. They offer calcium wedges, so this little guy here is a calcium wedge, so you get the purple views of the sun. Again, silly money in solar. £600, £800, £1,200, depending on the one you go for. The Lunt Solar Wedge. I think there was one on the First Light Optics sale over Christmas for about 300 quid, but normally they're about sort of heading towards 400 quid. There are other ones available which are cheaper, which will all do the same thing. Then recently, over the past several years, it's a company that's been going really since, I think, back in the 60s. A lot of the early NASA missions used these Daystar filters for views of the sun. But Daystar kind of really became more of a household name in the world of solar astronomy a few years ago with their Quark solar eyepiece there, which the beauty of the Quark solar eyepiece is you can put it in pretty much any refractor, any refracting telescope, and also keep the functionality of that refractor to use it for night time. And the gentle sum of a mere £1,000, you can pick yourself up a quark, okay, and they produce some really quite nice views of the sun. You'll notice there we have the different colours, okay, and we've got hydrogen alpha, we've got sodium, we've got the calcium there. They do other wavelengths. We've got hydrogen beta, I think magnesium. There's a whole range of different wavelengths that you can look in the sun using day-star filters, but they're all custom jobbies. So something like the calcium unit there is going to be at least several £1,000s. If you really have deep pockets, if you've won the lottery, if you've got bags of money and don't know what to spend it on, and they have a filter wheel there, where you can have 4 of these filters all in there, a bit like you would with nighttime filters. The last price I saw for that was a princely £42,000. So, yeah. Yeah, we'll have 2. Yeah, exactly. And don't forget then, when you've got £42,000 worth of filter, you ain't going to be putting it on the end of a 200 quid Skywatcher telescope. You know, these things are probably, the weight of the filter alone, you're going to need a silly amount. Anyway, but the quark, and quarks now, we can get these in calcium wavelengths, also in sodium wavelengths. Bit of a bargain price. Again, I was talking to people before about quality control of solar telescopes. It can be variable. It's quite frustrating with the money that they cost and the variability of the performance, if you like, of the product that's being sent out. But in their eyes, that's their budget bargain basement filter, you know, and when they're selling filters in the tens of thousands of dollars, pounds, doesn't matter what currency it's in, does it, let's be honest, they're kind of knocking them out of the door. Bringing it down back to earth a little bit more, mentioned to a few people, if you want to observe the sun, you want to observe sunspots, there's the beta solar film. You can pick that up on pretty much anywhere online now for an A4 sheet for about 20 quid, thereabouts, give or take postage and packing. And with that, it tells you how you can make a filter cell, just using cardboard. It's very blue, Peter. Some people don't like the idea, but it is safe. You know, it is perfectly safe. It kind of looks a bit like crinkled foil. It's a bit like like crisp packet material, describe it, which I think some people sometimes feel uneasy with. But it's actually very, very good. And for sort of £20 for an A4 sheet, if you want to, you can get it in a custom cell, pre-made. But then, as with anything, the price starts going up. And you know, for something like a 4-inch refractor, you're probably looking at about £60 thereabouts for something in a cell made up like that. It all depends what you're comfortable with. Again, the solar wedges there, that's a Barda one. Again, they're about £400. My advice with the solar wedges, you can pick up, if you do want to pick up a solar wedge, you can pick, those are the 2-inch versions, so the eyepiece size is 2 inches. They're about £400. You can pick up the 1.25" ones, the slightly smaller ones, for a bit less than 200 quid these days. I don't think they're that popular. I think people naturally gravitate towards the larger one, and they seem to be dropping the prices a bit of the smaller ones, but they all do the same job. If you're using either a wedge or the solar film, one of the Barda Continuum filters works really well. Again, it's all down to silly money, and if we can save money, let's save some money here, because the 1.25" version, again, 60, 70 quid maybe. The 2-inch version, we're probably up to about 120 quid. If you go on Astro Boot, somewhere like that, you can pick up a green filter for about 6 quid. They do exactly the same job. Maybe if we were sat at the top of a mountain in Tenerife and we had perfect seeing conditions, maybe we'll see a difference. But I think in the conditions we have in the UK, there really is no point spending the extra money. Barda do a K-line filter, a calcium K-line filter, and this often comes up on the forums. People message me, people mail me, saying, is it worth it? My honest answer, no, I don't think it is. It's about £200 or £300. It's half the price of the cheapest calcium filter, but you're not getting half the performance. It's very hard to work with. I'd avoid. Okay. If you are using hydrogen alpha on a refractor, so you've got quark, maybe you've got something like a 6-inch refractor, you're going to need an energy rejection filter on the front. The idea is, I'll use the analogy of the magnifying glass and the ant. We all know the outcome of that. It doesn't end very nicely for the ant. You don't want the same thing with your solar filters at the back of your scope. So we use an energy rejection filter. What that's doing is just letting through a certain wavelength of light, and it's reflecting the rest of it back out the front of your scope. Okay, definitely worth doing. Definitely worth doing. How can we image the sun? Well, nowadays there's a whole. It's actually quite an old picture. This now. There's a whole load of different cameras out there. I don't think they make the imaging source anymore. I certainly started off with one of the imaging source cameras. There's the Basler cams, there's IDS, there's PGR, there's the Celestron Skyrus. I think they're still going. The moment I'm using PGR cameras, I think that I quite like them. They work quite well. But really, you need to be imaging in monochrome light. So getting a mono camera. The idea with these cameras is you're recording, say, 500 or 1,000 frames, so that this video, and then what we're doing is software is picking out the sharpest frames and disregarding the frames that are blurred because of the poor seeing conditions. I always like to do things as cheaply or as free as possible, and certainly in terms of software. Often the software that comes with these cameras is horrible software, horrible interfaces. But the software out there called Firecapture, it's free to download, works with a whole load of different cameras. There's one, Jenica, which is a French piece of software, about €70. I've got both. I prefer Firecapture. I don't even really use Jenica anymore. It's all down to interfaces and how you like your workflow, how you like it to look on the screen. When we've captured all these images, we've taken all these pictures, what do we do next? So, like I said, we'll capture hundreds, maybe even thousands of images. If you remember the animation with the starlings flying in front of it, the sun was shimmering away in the scene. If you imagine the heat haze, the turbulence in the atmosphere. And what this software is doing, like I mentioned, it's picking out the sharpest frames. You can tell it to say pick out the sharpest 50, maybe the sharpest 100, you know, or a certain percentage. And it's stacking them, and by stacking them, it reduces the noise. We end up with an image that's got a higher signal to noise ratio. It's got a higher dynamic range, so that then when we're working with it afterwards in post-processing, we can do a lot more with it and get a lot more details out. And different ones that are out there. Registacks. I started off using Registacks. I'm not even sure what version it was. It wasn't version 6 way back when. Great piece of software. Avistack doesn't seem as popular nowadays. I don't see many people using it. But the popular one at the moment is one called AutoStackit. AutoStackit's now on number 3. I should probably update the slide actually. But again, all 3 of these are free to download. Again, there is software out there you can pay for, but I really don't see the point. All the free ones do exactly the same. Okay, so we get this image, and it comes out of the stacking software. What do we do with it then? Well, it kind of comes out. You can see here the box shows where it's been processed, and then the outside of the image, outside the box, shows the unprocessed. And what we need to be doing, we just need to be adding a little bit of sharpening to it, just to bring out some of the details. So you can see there, this is a calcium image. We've got the sunspots. You can kind of see a little bit of flaring going on. It's a crackling active region there. We've got some plage, other features there. And all you're doing is just sharpening it up. Piece of software here called IMPPG. I think it's a great piece of software because it really is simple. You either use that bit or you use that bit. It's one or the other. And there are effectively two sliders, and those are all your controls. We've got a curve there you can play around with, but there's not a lot. And you may think it's a bad thing, not having or not seemingly having as much control. But something I always find, like Registacks, okay, and again the same image there. There's all these different sliders. There's so many different sliders, and there's sliders within sliders, and up and down arrows, and all these different things here. And I often find, I kind of see this when I can spot Registacks images. I think because there's all these buttons and all these things that people can mess with, they mess with them by default, and people just twiddle and slide, and it's all over the place. And I think sometimes then you end up with these over-processed images, whereas really keeping it simple, I think, is the best way forward. And IMPPG is free; you can download it off the web. Registacks is free. Registacks works. People get great images from Registacks. I'm not poo-pooing Registacks, but I would say if you're a beginner, and these work for processing images of the moon as well, I would probably go for IMPPG just on simplicity, because you can kind of lose yourself in all these different settings. I think it's overly complicated. Unless you really know what you're doing, you can kind of end up spoiling things. All these images I mentioned before are black and white images. We're using mono cameras, and we like to see pretty colours. We like to put colours on things. So these are all kind of false colour images of the sun, but we apply these colours. I personally use Photoshop. I'll be quite honest, the only reason I use Photoshop is because I get it, work gives it me, which is great. But Photoshop, if you have ever looked to buy it, is absolutely ridiculously priced. It's a fantastic piece of software, but it's ridiculously priced. And if you don't want to spend the money buying Photoshop, a piece of software you can buy is called GIMP. I make no apologies if, depending on your search engine, you type in GIMP as to what comes up, but it is an image. The one you are looking for is some soft image processing software, and all that's open source, so there's kind of people working on it all the time, and it's free. And essentially what people are doing is mimicking Photoshop and coming up. I'm not going to say it's a dodgy copy of Photoshop, it isn't at all. It's open source work, but it does all the same things as Photoshop does. And if you're not using Photoshop and you want something that's kind of got a bit more flexibility to it than, say, than the basic packages that you get in with Windows or with Macs or anything like that, then GIMP, I think, is a good one to go for. Okay, so coming full circle, if you remember way back at the start, one of the things I want to talk about is the whole outreach thing. And I know as a society, as an astronomical society, outreach is something that kind of features very prominently. I mentioned I work in school, and I see this all the time. I work in an inner city school. Inner city schools generally don't do as well. It's a fact. It doesn't matter really whether it's an inner city school in Birmingham. I'm sure that you'll be aware of similar schools in Liverpool. There's bound to be. We could pick any city in the country really. And kind of what this big pile of coloured spaghetti shows here basically is these are called PISA scores. And what a PISA score is, they take a sample of students, and they take their math, their science, and their reading abilities, and then they do the same test globally, and we start comparing the scores. And here we are down here in the middle, in the black line there, and we ain't that good really. You know, we think of ourselves as a country, we think we're up there, but here we are down in the 20s, in the teens. We ain't that great. And when we start looking, here we've got above us the Czech Republic, Denmark, I'm just randomly picking them here, Austria, Canada, Poland, Finland, Estonia. There's a whole host of countries that are above us, or above our students, our children, in terms of their abilities in maths, science and reading. And my analogy would be, there we are, ranked 26. Vietnam's above us, you know, France, Germany, I'm not going to read them all out. We think, as a country, we really do very well, but globally, we ain't that good. You know, to use the old school report, it's kind of somewhere around a D. We could do a lot better. And it's the old thing about kids, are they interested? And is it going to play? Oh. Let's see, try and... Oh. Quick phone not available. Okay, it would if it is, but it isn't. It's not. I got a time-lapse video there. What the time-lapse was going to show was the eclipse with the where I took it. I took the time-lapse of the calcium image from a few years ago, and it's basically setting up, and you get several hundred children coming out with the solar glasses. All of them come looking through the scope. We all observe the eclipse with their projecting it. Various things going on. Lots of fun. We have these stereotypes, I think, of children. I've worked with children now in schools for nearly 20 years, and it's very easy, I think, in today's society to plonk our kids in front of TVs, or plonk them on devices, or plonk them in front of games, or anything like this. And it's great because kids are like sponges. Whatever the most interesting thing is, they will do. So if they're playing, I don't know, whatever games, I don't play games on phones, but whatever games people are playing on phones and things like this, that's interesting. However, if you show them other things that are interesting, they will go to the most interesting thing. And I find when we start showing them things like the sun, kids are interested in interesting things, you know, and the sun is interesting. I talked before about the little boy at Solar Sphere and his space worms. People are interested in seeing what's going on, and kids are exactly the same. And for me, that's why outreach is so important. Whether it's solar outreach, whether it's nighttime outreach, it's showing people these different things and things that people aren't used to seeing. People have inquiring minds. People want to see things. And for me, you know, going out in the sunshine with the solar scopes like this, it is a great way of doing it. For a few years, we went down to the Hertzman Astronomy Festival. That's normally sort of the first weekend in September. Not been able to go down for the past couple of years for sort of various reasons, the eclipse being one of them last year. But it's an annual festival, and it's a great place to go. If you've not been down there, it's got the big domes with the big refractors in. You know, it's a really interesting place, and they offer camping. There's B&Bs and things close by, and you've got this family-friendly festival. I mentioned a few times, maybe some people on the photos here, who knows, about Solar Sphere in Bilthwells in Mid Wales. Been going there with the solar setup every year since it started, and again, it's a great family environment. Sometimes people, it's a Marmite thing, I think. It's this thing, an astronomy and music festival. You know, sometimes people don't make the connection. You know, this isn't like Glastonbury. This isn't people walking around with smelly blankets on and things like that. You know, it is a family festival. There's lots of things going on for the kiddies, making rockets, painting, you know, whole load of different things. And I know some of the guys here, which I've met there, which is kind of one of the reasons I'm here tonight. We're there again this year. Check it out. If you have been thinking about checking it out, I would wholeheartedly recommend it. It's a good weekend. Okay, so coming back to this thing about outreach, what can we do? So we've organised our day's outreach, and then lo and behold, here we are, because we've all got our solar glasses, so that just attracts clouds. As soon as the scopes come out, the clouds come over. What can we do? Well, one of the easiest ways is our bit of spectroscopy, okay? And you can do this, you can make these up. There's loads of designs for these on the internet, really, really easy to make. All you need, a couple of, say, pencil sharpener blades or Stanley knife blades, doesn't really matter which, you're just looking for two straight edges. You're making a slit, there's a kind of really fine slit in there. You're looking at an optical disc. They used to say CDs, but DVDs work better. Blu-rays will work even better. And your UHD discs will work even better, and that is because if you imagine the data on the disk, the spacing of the data gets finer the higher the quality it is, and the higher the quality, the better it will split up the light. But what we can do with this is we can start looking at different light sources, and often one of the best ways is to look at lights, natural, artificial lights in the room, and what you'll see, if you remember the slide back at the start, different light sources give off different spectral views, I suppose, and natural light will give off a different one than a fluorescent light will. Okay, and there's designs for these all over the web. Really, really easy to make. If you want to, you can make up the slits in advance. So, you know, sort of kiddies aren't messing around with metal edges. But it's really, really easy to make. Bit of tape, very good old-fashioned blue peter. And then with a bit of spectroscopy, off into the wider universe we go. And what does spectroscopy tell us? Well, depending on what we see, all these different wavelengths correspond to different atoms. So from that, if we can see these lines in stars, we know those atoms are present. Depending on the intensity, depending on, if you like, the spread of it, we can then start working out the temperature of the star. Once we know the temperature, once we know what atoms are there, we can then start getting complicated, we can start looking at redshifts, we can then start working how far things are away. Okay? To throw some wilder ideas in there, we talk, there's exoplanets. Exoplanets are becoming kind of very, very popular. You know, these new planets around distant stars, and some ideas we can maybe throw in there. We can start taking spectral readings of the planet's atmospheres, so we can start seeing what's going on in the planet's atmospheres. How about maybe some ideas then here? If we were observing a planet's atmosphere, what happens if we start seeing it oxygen rich? What happens if we then start seeing there's gases like carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, methanes, things like that? Maybe that could be a signature of a polluting society. Maybe it's a bit of an indicator of alien life. Who knows? Okay, we're going off into the realms of speculation, but the point is, these are the sorts of discussions that very easily inquiring minds you can go with once you start showing people spectra and doing it like that. You can buy spectroscopes, you know, made up if you want to do it that way. They are expensive. Your old boxes of bran flakes, your old boxes of cornflakes, a few CDs and DVDs, a bit of black electrical tape, a few pencil sharpener blades, it's a lot cheaper. Okay, an interesting one to finish on, I think. I mentioned about going to Iceland and kind of enjoying going to Iceland. One of the things I like about Iceland, I like the landscape, and I just like this whole volcanic landscape. And you may or may not be aware, but our Viking friends, they settled in Iceland way back sort of 900 AD, something like that, so 1100 odd years ago now. And they went to all these different places, and they had their stories, the sagas they're called, okay, and the sagas of this record, if you like, of the Vikings out there. I mean, you know, you can dramatise it, you know, when we start looking at Thor and Loki and all these sorts of things. But a very interesting one that they talk about is this thing called the Sonnenstone, or the Sunstone, okay? And you might say, okay, so what's that got to do with anything? Well, our Viking friends were very good navigators, and if you've ever seen a Viking longboat, the draft on the boat, it's really quite low, and I'm not sure I'd want to be in one of these boats crashing across the North Atlantic with sort of 10-metre swells. It must have been quite a hairy experience, to say the least. But what the Vikings were very good at was their navigation. They knew where they were going. And when you read the sagas, when you look at the Viking text, there's no real evidence that they were using compasses. you know, there was no real evidence of magnetic compasses. But one of the things they do talk about is the sunstone or the sonnenstone. Now, what the sunstone is, in Iceland, one of the minerals that you get is called Iceland spar, which is a calcite mineral. And calcite minerals are quite unique. They have some quite unique properties. And one of them is something called birefringence. And kind of in simple terms, what happens is, if we take a piece of calcite and we put a spot on it, and if you're a Viking king, that may be a jewel. You may put your jewel onto the sonnenstone. But depending, this birefringence almost gives us these reflections, okay? And depending on the angle, one of the spots will appear lighter or darker than the other spots, okay? But what the Vikings found was when both spots were of equal brightness, then the long axis of the sonnenstone pointed towards the sun. Okay, so you can kind of see there, it's lighter, it's darker. Both are equal, it's darker, it's lighter. Okay, see it on the bottom there. And the long axis of this crystal points towards the sun. So it's telling them where the sun is. Okay, how does that help matters? Well, I mentioned before, back in August, in May or June, you've got pretty much, it doesn't go dark in Iceland. In August, you get a couple of hours of darkness. The way this works is by sunlight is polarised, and it's working on the polarisation of light. And one of the beauties about this is, if you imagine the twilight arc, so that sunset glow in the sky, that's still light from the sun. Okay, but just because we can't see the sun doesn't mean we can't see its effects. So the sonnenstone will still work when the sun is slightly below the horizon. The sonnenstone will also work when it's foggy. If you imagine those sea fogs that you get, where, you know, sort of at sea level, you've got this thick fog, you know, maybe 20 or 30 metres above, it's clear blue skies, but you've got this cold layer, the marine layer, which causes the fog. The light is still coming from the sun, it's still polarised. So we can still find the direction of it. And I think, for me, it's kind of a very exciting thing. I keep trying to get hold of true Icelandic spar, and it's incredibly hard to get hold of a proper piece of Icelandic spar. It's advertised as Icelandic spar, but in brackets right at the bottom it says calcite. No, that's not the same thing. It's diamonds and diamantes, you know. They're two different things. They both sparkle, but you know, they're quite different. And you can get hold of Icelandic spar, but not big lumps like this. And I think it would be fascinating to get hold of a large piece, and you know, to put on the spot, the jewel, whatever you want to call it, and try it as outreach. And you can kind of see here in the text, it's talking about the sun there was only 1 degree above the horizon and hidden by trees, but it's still pointing towards the sun. I think it's quite a fascinating thing that these people, you know, sort of 1100 years ago, that they found this effect. They might not necessarily understand the effect, but this is kind of what science is, isn't it? It's about observation, it's about repetition, and we keep doing these things, and we keep seeing the same effect. You know, then we can use it to predict. We might not necessarily understand the effect, but we can certainly use it to predict things. Okay, I'm going to finish on this one. If you are interested in the sun, people mentioned before, got my website, Brierley Hill Solar. I'm also on Facebook, if that is your medium of social media. I also am one of the admins on the Charlie Bates Solar Astronomy Project Forum. They've got their solar chat, which is a great friendly forum. Okay, there's no limits to uploads and things like some forums where your image size is going to be whatever. Great friendly place. If you do want to find out information, there's lots of knowledgeable people there. Charlie Bates Solar Astronomy Project, that, if you like, it is the father project for the whole thing. ran by Stephen Ramsden. That's on pretty much every social media platform going. There we are. He's got his website solarastronomy.org, which has got lots of reviews of solar scopes. So if you are thinking about buying solar scopes, the chances are Stephen's bought them, reviewed them, used them. There's not many solar scopes this guy hasn't tried. The one I always do recommend is, if you are a beginner, either your local society or the Society for Popular Astronomy. The people there do some great work and give out some great advice. Okay, I am going to leave it there. I'm conscious of time. It's 9:30. It must be time for the pub soon. So, thank you very much for having me, and good night, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.